She carries her youngest on her back because he can no longer walk. He's 5 years old and he stopped speaking 3 days ago. Not from grief, though there is plenty of that, but from hunger so deep it has hollowed out even the impulse to cry. His mouth hangs slightly open. His eyes track the road ahead with the blank animal patience of the very near dead. Her name, if anyone still uses it, is something like Elswith, or Margaret, or Catherine. She answers to nothing now. There are no neighbours left to call her by her name. The village she left behind, a cluster of 8 or 9 dwellings strung along a mill stream in a fold of the Flemish plain, is already invisible behind her. She did not look back when she left. There was nothing to look back at. The thatch had caved under the weight of snow 2 months ago. The miller's family were the last to go, and they went silently in the night, taking their one surviving ox. What she carries is a cloth bundle containing a crust of dark bread the size of a fist, a rusted iron needle, a fragment of a saint's bone wrapped in linen, and the name of a town she has heard about, repeated to her by a dying man in a ditch. A town 3 days east where there was said to be a Cistercian house distributing grain. She does not know if the dying man was right. She does not know if the Cistercian house still stands. She does not know if 3 days east is still 3 days if you are carrying a child on your back and your legs are beginning to do the strange, loose thing legs do when the body has been eating itself for too long. The road she walks is not empty. It is never empty. Not in a famine year. Not in the long nightmare of the early 14th century, when the skies of northern Europe cracked open and refused to close again for 7 years, when the rains came every summer and the wheat rotted in the fields and the price of bread climbed so far beyond the reach of ordinary people that mothers began calculating with terrible precision how many days they could feed their children before the calculation no longer mattered. The road she walks has a name in the chronicles, not her road specifically, but roads like it. They are called by the clerics who wrote down what they saw, viae miserorum, the roads of the miserable, the hunger roads, and they ran in every direction across the face of medieval Europe, threading between exhausted villages and desperate cities, traced by the feet of people who had made the only calculation that remained available to them. Stay and die where you were born, or move and perhaps not die. Perhaps. This is the story of the Great Famine of medieval Europe, not as it is usually told from the towers of castles and the margins of illuminated manuscripts, but from the road itself, from the mud and the cold and the unbearable weight of a child who has stopped speaking, from the mathematics of survival that ordinary people in their millions were forced to perform across the long hungry decades of the early 1300s. It is a story of desperation and of extraordinary human endurance, of the mechanisms of medieval society, the monasteries and the market towns, the lords and the beggars and the guildsmen, as they buckled and held and sometimes collapsed under the weight of a catastrophe no one had words for. It is a story of the roads themselves, who built them, who controlled them, what it cost to walk them, and what waited at the other end. And it is above all a story of what hunger does to people, not just to their bodies, though it does terrible things to bodies, but to their relationships, their faith, their sense of who they are and what they owe each other, of how communities fracture and reform and sometimes simply disappear, of the strange, stubborn persistence of hope in circumstances that appear designed to extinguish it. The village Aylesworth left behind had a name that the local priest would have written in the parish register, a name in the language of place that is partly Old French, partly older still, Germanic or Flemish, or something that was already ancient when the Franks arrived. Names like that hold history the way soil holds moisture, not visibly, but persistently, available to whoever knows how to read it. She did not think about the name. She thought about the road, and about the child on her back, and about whether the bread she carried was enough to make it to the next farmstead. The farmstead she was heading toward had been abandoned too, though she did not know this yet. It had been abandoned 2 weeks earlier by a family whose own calculation had run out before hers. This was the rhythm of famine migration in the early years. You left toward places that had already left toward places that had already left. A chain of disappointed destinations stretching across the landscape, like a series of notes passing through an echo chamber, each one slightly fainter than the last. The child on her back had a name too. She used it still, quietly, when she shifted his weight and he stirred. She would have used it when he cried, in the weeks before he stopped crying. She used it now as a form of continuing address to someone who might still hear her even if he could no longer respond. Names are the most basic form of insisting that a person is still there. The Great Famine began with weather, but it was made by the collision of weather with a demographic and economic system that had for several generations been operating at the outer edges of its sustainable capacity. By 1300, the population of northern Europe had roughly doubled from what it had been in the year 1000. This expansion had been possible because of a sustained agricultural improvement over the intervening centuries. New land brought under cultivation, new technology in the form of the heavy plough that could turn the denser soils of northern Europe, improved crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility, and the relatively benign climate of the medieval warm period that gave marginal land and marginal harvests a better chance than they would otherwise have had. The growth was not sustainable indefinitely. By the early 14th century, the available agricultural land in the most densely populated regions of northern Europe, Flanders, the Paris Basin, the English Midlands, was fully utilised. There was no more land to bring under the plough. Population pressure on the existing agricultural resource had risen to the point where any significant reduction in yield, a bad harvest, a late frost, a wet summer, would immediately translate into price increases and shortfalls that the system had no buffer to absorb. This was the world that the rains of 1315 hit. Not a world with margins, not a world with slack. A world that had been fully extended toward its limits for a generation, and that met the worst agricultural crisis of the medieval period, with no reserves of any significance and no mechanisms for creating reserves that had not already been used. The perfect storm, as we say now, though the people in it had no such phrase. They had the weather, and they had their fields, and they had each other, and they had the road. It began with weather. That is almost always how famine begins. Not with a single catastrophic event, not a volcano or an earthquake or a war, though those can certainly accelerate the process, but with something slower and more bewildering. A season that does not cooperate. A summer that turns wet too early and stays wet too long. A frost that comes in September and kills what the rain did not. In the spring of 1315, across most of northern and central Europe, the rains that had been falling all winter simply continued. They continued through April, when the fields should have been drying out enough for planting. They continued through May and June, when the wheat and rye needed dry warmth to take root and establish. They continued through July and August, when the sun was supposed to do its indispensable work of turning green stalks gold. The harvest of 1315 failed, not partially, not the kind of shortfall that forces hard choices and empties the cheaper market stalls and makes everyone a little thinner going into winter. It failed comprehensively, across an arc of territory, stretching from Ireland in the west to Poland and the Baltic states in the east, from Scandinavia in the north to northern France and the Low Countries in the south. The densest, most productive agricultural heartland in medieval Europe produced in that one season perhaps a third of what it normally could. Medieval people understood bad harvests. They had centuries of practice with them. Every farming community maintained what historians now call a grain buffer, surplus grain kept back from the previous harvest, stored in barns and monastery cellars and the locked storerooms of manorial estates, precisely against the eventuality of a bad year. A bad year was survivable. You tightened your belt and ate the buffer and planted more aggressively next spring and hoped for better weather. What medieval people were not equipped to survive, what no agricultural society has ever been fully equipped to survive, was the same bad weather returning year after year, eating through the buffer before it could be replenished. In 1316 the rains came again. The harvest of 1316 was even worse than 1315. The buffer that had kept millions of people alive through this first bad winter was nearly exhausted. Prices which had climbed sharply in 1315 now climbed into a register that was genuinely apocalyptic. In some parts of Flanders and northern France, the price of grain increased by a factor of 10 in 18 months. A family that had spent a fifth of its income on bread in 1314 was now spending everything it earned, everything on bread, and still there was not enough. The mechanisms of medieval famine are worth understanding in detail, because they operated very differently from how we tend to imagine catastrophe. famine did not announce itself with a single visible moment of crisis. It arrived slowly, in stages, each stage giving way to the next before most people had fully comprehended the implications of the last. First came the price shock, the sudden dizzying realization that what you had always been able to afford was now beyond you. This hit the urban poor and the landless rural poor first and hardest. These were people who bought their food rather than growing it, who lived on wages that did not move even as prices did. A Flemish weaver in 1315 earned more or less what a Flemish weaver had earned in 1310. He now needed that entire wage, every week, just for bread. Everything else, meat, fish, legumes, the occasional luxury of a fresh vegetable, vanished from his family's diet overnight. Then came the asset liquidation. As grain prices rose and incomes failed to keep pace, households began selling what they had. First the non-essentials, a spare blanket, a piece of jewellery, tools for crafts that no longer paid. Then the essentials, the second ox, the pig that had been earmarked for winter salting, the plough. Then things that were not meant to be sold, the seed grain set aside for next year's planting. And finally, in a last terrible inversion of everything property was supposed to mean, the land itself, sold or mortgaged or simply abandoned by people who no longer had the means or the will to farm it. Asset liquidation is not migration. It is what people do instead of migration. When they still believe that the situation is temporary, that next year will be better, that selling the ox is the sensible pragmatic choice, rather than the first step in a chain of losses that ends on a roadside far from home. By the winter of 1316 into 1317, the asset liquidation phase was ending for millions of families across northern Europe. They had sold what could be sold, they had eaten what could be eaten, they had borrowed what could be borrowed, and the rains, everyone understood now, were not a one-year anomaly. Something was wrong with the sky. What was wrong with the sky, though no medieval person had the conceptual framework to describe it this way, was that the climate of northern Europe was shifting. The medieval warm period, a sustained interval of relatively mild temperatures and favourable agricultural conditions that had allowed Europe's population to nearly triple between 900 and 1300, was ending. What was beginning, in the early 14th century, was the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cooling of average temperatures that would, over the following decades and centuries, push the viable agricultural zone southward and reduce yields across the entire northern tier of the continent. The people on the roads in 1316 and 1317 did not know any of this. They knew only that the sky had broken and the grain was gone, and the road was the only remaining option. The scale of what moved across the roads of medieval Europe in the famine years is almost impossible to recover with precision. Medieval record-keeping was not designed to count refugees, it was designed to count taxpayers and tithe-payers and tenants. When people stopped being any of those things, when they left their land, their parish, their lord's jurisdiction, they largely left the written record as well. What the records do show, in the annals of monasteries, in the accounts of city governments, in the occasional vivid passage of a chronicler who watched the roads fill up outside his window, is a movement of people on a scale that medieval Europe had not seen since the migrations of the late Roman period. Hundreds of thousands of people, probably millions, set out on roads they had never travelled before, toward destinations they could not be certain still existed, carrying almost nothing. The Hunger Road was not metaphor, it was geography. It was the specific, practical, brutal reality of trying to survive a famine in a world where the only mechanism available was your own feet. And so they walked. Not everyone left. That is the first and most important thing to understand about famine migration, because it runs contrary to how we tend to imagine mass catastrophe, as something that strikes indiscriminately, that produces a uniform wave of displaced people all responding to the same crisis in the same way. Famine is not uniform. Its pressures are precise and discriminating, and they fall with devastating specificity on some people, while leaving others, sometimes the people in the next house, the next field, the next village, temporarily untouched. The decision to leave, or more accurately the point at which a family reached the end of its capacity to remain, depended on a calculation that involved dozens of interlocking variables. How much land did they hold? What was the quality of that land? Had they managed to harvest anything at all in 1315 and 1316, Or had the rains destroyed everything? Did they have animals still? A pig, an ox, a few chickens represented months of additional survival, even in the worst of circumstances. Did they have relatives in other places? A brother who had moved to a town? A married daughter whose husband had farmland on better drained soil? Did they owe rents to a lord who was, or was not, prepared to defer collection in a crisis year? The landless left first. This is not surprising. The landless poor, the cotters and day labourers and itinerant craftspeople who formed perhaps the bottom quarter of rural medieval society, had no buffer of any kind. They owned no animals, they held no land, they ate by selling their labour, and in a famine year, the demand for agricultural labour collapsed precisely when the price of food rose. There was no harvest to bring in, no ploughing that made sense when seed prices were prohibitive, no point in hiring hands when the fields were empty. The landless lost their income and their access to food simultaneously, and they had nothing to sell that would bridge the gap. For these people, the decision to leave was not a decision at all. It was a recognition that the alternatives had already closed. The road was not a choice among options. It was the only option remaining. The smallholders followed. These were the people who held just enough land to keep a family in ordinary years. A few acres of the common field, a strip here and a strip there, enough to produce a surplus in good years and barely enough in bad ones. In the famine years, their land produced nothing. They had initially survived by selling their surplus animals, then their non-essential tools, then their seed grain. By the second winter, the smallholders with no other resources began to appear on the roads, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who have been forced to admit something they spent a long time refusing to believe. The larger landholders, the peasants with a vigate or more, the minor freeholders, the craftspeople who owned their workshops and their tools, had more options and used them for longer. They could mortgage their land rather than abandoning it. They could borrow from richer neighbours or from the local monastery. They could sell down their animal stock slowly, rationing the protein. They could reduce consumption in ways that the already minimal diet of a landless labourer did not permit. But even for them, the famine years eventually closed off one option after another. By 1317, by 1318, you find in the records evidence of people who had been solidly in the middling rank of rural society, people who paid their rents, served on local juries, were witnesses to their neighbours' wills, suddenly appearing in the lists of those who had abandoned their holdings. Abandonment was not only a tragedy for the family in question, it was a cascading problem for the entire local economy. A holding abandoned meant a labour supply reduced and tax revenue lost, and the physical infrastructure of the village, the drainage ditches, the hedges, the bridges, the paths between fields, no longer maintained. The geography of movement was not random. People did not simply walk in whatever direction their feet pointed. They moved along paths that were shaped by their existing knowledge of the world, and that knowledge was, for most medieval peasants, quite narrow. The typical English villager of 1315 had probably never travelled more than 15 or 20 miles from the place where he was born. He knew the names of the nearest market towns. He might have made a pilgrimage to a regional shrine, or travelled once to a large seasonal fair. He knew the direction of the nearest city because he had heard it named so many times that it had acquired the quality of a landmark in his mental geography, even if he had never seen its walls. This meant that famine migration tended to flow along established routes. The roads that already carried market traffic and pilgrims and the seasonal movement of livestock. It tended to flow toward established centres of gravity, the market town where you had sold wool or bought salt, the monastery where your priest said the brothers kept grain, the city whose walls you had never entered but whose existence you knew, as a fact the way you knew the existence of saints, whose faces you had never seen. And it tended to involve a kind of hope that was not quite rational, a hope constructed partly from genuine information and partly from the stories that travel faster than any refugee column. The stories moved through the famine landscape like a separate current alongside the physical movement of refugees. A dying man in a ditch had heard from a merchant's driver who had spoken to a monk that the Cistercians at the Abbey of Villers were distributing grain to all comers. A woman on the road told anyone who would listen that in the city 3 days east the guilds were giving bread. A child separated from his family had been found near the gates of a great lord's castle, and the steward had taken him in and was feeding anyone who showed up at the kitchen door. Some of these stories were true, Some were misremembered versions of things that had been true but were no longer. Some were wishes that had crystallized, through the repetition of desperate people, into something that felt like fact. The stories did not stop circulating when they turned out to be false. They mutated. The Cistercians at Villa had run out of grain, but there was another house further on. The Lord Steward had been replaced, but the new one was said to be more generous. What the stories provided, above and beyond any practical information they contained, was direction. The knowledge that there was somewhere to go, that the road led somewhere. That movement was not merely the abandonment of what you had, but the pursuit of what might still be possible. This was the quiet engine of medieval famine migration. Not despair exactly, but the particular form of hope available to people who have already lost almost everything. The hope that is not about getting back what you had, but about getting to something, anything, on the other side of the road you're walking. They moved in the shape of their hope, and the roads held their weight. The specific timing of departure mattered enormously in ways that the people making the decision could not fully calculate. Leave too early, before you had truly exhausted your remaining resources, and you were on the road with a slightly larger margin of strength and slightly better weather, but you had surrendered the land and the roof and the relationships that might, with a different weather pattern next year, have become viable again. Leave too late, after the winter had taken your remaining strength and your last animals, and you were on the road with nothing, in the worst conditions, toward destinations that the people who had left a month before you were already competing for. The ideal moment was a narrow window that was only visible in retrospect, and most people missed it in one direction or the other. The ones who left early felt like cowards or wastrels, surrendering things that might have been saved. The ones who left late felt like failures, having stayed too long in the sinking boat. The ones who left in the middle felt like nothing, because they were too busy walking to feel like anything. Women travelling alone faced hazards that added a distinct layer of danger to the already dangerous business of the road. Medieval Europe was not a society that protected unattended women from harm, and the presence of large numbers of desperate people on the roads created opportunities for violence that some individuals took. The chronicles record, with varying degrees of explicitness, the sexual violence that accompanied famine migration, the attacks on women who had no protectors, who were too weak to resist, who were too far from any human witness for there to be any consequence to the act. Women who travelled with children, paradoxically, were sometimes safer than women who travelled alone. The child transformed the social meaning of the travelling woman. She was a mother, a role that commanded a certain residual protection from even the most morally degraded social environment. Not a guarantee, not remotely a guarantee, but a different social signal than a woman alone. The travelling groups that formed on the road were often organised by the logic of mutual protection, rather than pre-existing social bonds. A man who joined his walking pace to that of a woman, and her children, was not necessarily known to them before the road. He was providing protection in exchange for the social cover that travelling as a group provided. The reduced likelihood of robbery and violence that a group of apparent family members attracted, compared to a lone male traveller, who was more likely to be treated as a threat. These impromptu social formations, the road family, the temporary travelling community, were one of the more remarkable social inventions of the famine migration. They were made possible by the specific conditions of the road, the enforced proximity, the shared purpose, the temporary suspension of the hierarchies and identities of the communities left behind. On the road, a landless labourer and a smallholder's widow and a skilled weaver from 3 different villages might travel together for a week, sharing information and food and whatever protection they could provide each other, and form a community of obligation that would have been impossible in any of their home communities. The information economy of the famine road deserves its own consideration, because it was the medium through which the road's social life operated. Travellers exchanged information constantly, about road conditions ahead, about conditions at the destination they had come from or were heading toward, about individuals or families that might be trusted or should be avoided. This exchange was not organised. It happened in passing, at rest stops, at the confluence of roads, in the improvised camps that formed wherever a stretch of shelter or a water source drew people together. The quality of the information was extremely variable. Some of it was accurate and current, transmitted recently from a reliable source. Some of it was accurate but outdated. The monastery that had been distributing food when the informant left it 3 weeks ago might have run out since then. Some of it was garbled in transmission, the detail that made the difference between a true and a false report lost somewhere in a chain of retelling. And some of it was simply invented, by people who had learned that false hope was a tradable commodity on the road, that you could get something for the story of the Cistercians with their full granary, even if you had never been within 50 miles of that monastery. The result was that the road's information environment was a complex mixture of genuine intelligence and noise, and navigating it required exactly the kind of judgment that hunger systematically impaired. The famine migrant had to assess the reliability of strangers, weight the probability of different reports, make spatial and temporal calculations about distances and times, and likely rates of resource depletion, and do all of this with a mind running on reduced capacity under conditions of emotional stress, while also managing the immediate demands of walking and carrying and keeping children alive. The wonder is not that so many people made bad decisions on the hunger road. The wonder is that so many managed to make sufficiently good ones. Before we can understand what the hunger road demanded, we need to understand what it took, what hunger actually does to a human body, not in the abstract, not as a moral statement, but as a precise progressive physiological process that unfolds in stages across days and weeks and months, changing the capacity and the consciousness of the person experiencing it. The first stage of serious caloric deprivation is deceptively manageable. The body has reserves, stored glycogen in the liver and muscles, adipose tissue that can be metabolized for energy, and a robust endocrine system designed over millions of years of evolutionary history precisely for the management of food scarcity. In the first days of significant undereating, a person feels hungry, of course, and perhaps irritable, and somewhat fatigued, but the capacity for physical and cognitive work is largely preserved. Medieval peasants experiencing the first weeks of a famine shortage were often still working, still planning, still capable of complex assessment of their situation. By the second and third weeks of serious deprivation, consuming perhaps half or less of the calories the body requires for basic maintenance, the body begins to shift its metabolic strategy in ways that are increasingly costly. The stored glycogen is depleted. The body begins breaking down muscle tissue for glucose, not because it has run out of fat, but because the brain requires a specific form of fuel, glucose, that fat cannot directly provide. Muscle wasting begins early, progresses steadily, and is not reversible without refeeding. A person who has been seriously hungry for a month is not merely thinner, they are physiologically different in ways that will persist long after they begin eating again. The immune system is among the first systems to be compromised. Proteins that would normally maintain immune function are rerouted toward basic metabolic needs. The result is an extraordinary susceptibility to infections that a well-nourished person would shrug off in days. A chest cold becomes pneumonia, a small wound becomes septic. The diseases that kill famine populations, and the Great Famine killed millions, more from disease than from pure starvation, are opportunistic infections that healthy bodies routinely survive. Edema, the swelling of soft tissues due to protein deficiency, is one of the characteristic signs of advanced starvation that appears repeatedly in medieval sources. When chroniclers describe famine victims with swollen bellies and swollen faces and swollen legs, they are not exaggerating or metaphorizing. They are describing a clinically specific phenomenon, kwashiorkor, or protein energy malnutrition, in which the body's declining plasma proteins can no longer maintain the osmotic pressure that keeps fluid in the bloodstream rather than leaking into surrounding tissue. A person with advanced edema looks paradoxically not thin but swollen. Their face is puffy, their belly is distended, their legs are thick. Medieval observers sometimes read this swelling as a sign of disease rather than starvation, and in a sense they were not wrong. Edema is the body's disease process responding to malnutrition. But the misreading had consequences. People who appeared swollen were sometimes turned away from food distribution points on the grounds that they were sick rather than hungry, when in fact their sickness and their hunger were the same thing. The cognitive effects of hunger are among its most important and least discussed consequences. Sustained caloric deprivation does not merely weaken the body, it systematically impairs judgment, memory, attention, and the capacity for planning. A study conducted in the mid-20th century, the Minnesota starvation experiment, documented in painful clinical detail what happened to well-nourished men subjected to semi-starvation for 6 months. They became obsessed with food. Their capacity for abstract thought declined sharply. They became emotionally flat, easily irritated, and incapable of the sustained concentration that complex tasks require. Their social bonds frayed, their sense of the future contracted to the next meal. Medieval famine migrants were not experiencing controlled semi-starvation. They were experiencing in many cases near total starvation, combined with cold exposure, physical exhaustion, grief, and the cognitive demands of navigating an unfamiliar landscape with no map and no reliable information. The decision-making they were required to perform, which road, which town, whom to trust, when to stop and when rest was too dangerous, was being performed by minds that had been systematically damaged by the same catastrophe that demanded the decisions. This cognitive narrowing had profound social consequences. One of the things the Minnesota study documented most vividly was the breakdown of prosocial behavior under sustained starvation. Men who had been, by all accounts, generous, cooperative, and community-minded became, as the experiment progressed, increasingly self-focused, competitive over food, and unable to maintain the patterns of mutual support and emotional reciprocity that characterized their pre-study lives. Some became hostile, some became profoundly asocial, preferring to sit alone than to maintain the social performance that community life required. In the context of famine migration, this psychological narrowing had direct survival implications. Medieval survival on the road depended heavily on cooperative behavior, sharing information about routes and resources, traveling in groups for mutual protection, looking after the sick and the young. These cooperative behaviors required exactly the kind of sustained social engagement and long-term thinking that hunger systematically impaired. The road created a brutal feedback loop in which the conditions that made cooperation necessary also made it harder to sustain. And yet, and this is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Great Famine and the people who moved through it, cooperation persisted. It persisted in the face of everything that militated against it. The road was not only a place of individual desperation, it was also, repeatedly, a space of solidarity, of people looking after people they did not know, of communities forming in motion that could not have formed in any other way. The body was failing, the social bond was not always, not entirely. That distinction between what the body could sustain and what the will could sometimes sustain beyond the body's capacity is part of what the hunger road teaches, not as comfort, but as a fact that demands attention. The roads of medieval Europe were not built for famine migrants. They were built, insofar as they were built at all, for commerce, for military movement, for the passage of pilgrims and churchmen and the livestock of lords. The great Roman roads that formed the spine of the European road network had been laid down more than 1,000 years before the Great Famine, and they were maintained, in the centuries after Rome, by a patchwork of responsibilities that ensured that no one in particular was ever clearly accountable for the state of any given stretch of surface. The Roman roads themselves, the famous viae that ran in their extraordinary straight lines from one end of the former empire to the other, remained usable in many places simply because their construction was so robust that 1,000 years of intermittent maintenance had not managed to fully destroy them. The drainage systems that kept the roadbed dry, the layers of graded stone that gave the surface resilience, the bridges built with engineering so sophisticated that many of them were still standing in the 14th century. These were the inheritance of a civilization that had understood, with unusual clarity, that roads were infrastructure, and infrastructure required investment. Medieval Europe, by contrast, had largely lost both the organizational capacity and the conceptual framework for treating roads as public infrastructure. The responsibility for maintaining roads was distributed among so many overlapping jurisdictions: the king, the church, the local lord, the adjacent town corporation, the toll collector, the pilgrim hospitals, that the practical result was often that no one maintained them at all. Tolls were the financial mechanism through which road use was theoretically compensated. Every major road in medieval Europe passed through multiple toll points: bridges, town gates, river crossings, market approaches, at each of which a payment was extracted theoretically in exchange for the maintenance of the road and the safety of the traveller. In practice, the connection between toll revenue and road maintenance was loose to the point of fiction. Toll rights were valuable properties held by lords and towns and monasteries, and the income they generated was as often spent on other things as on roads. For famine migrants, tolls represented a serious practical problem. They had, by definition, almost no money. The few coins that a family might have carried when they left home were quickly depleted by the modest but unavoidable expenses of the road: the toll at the river crossing, the coin demanded by the bridge keeper, the fee for permission to camp in a field rather than sleep in a ditch. By the time a refugee family had been on the road for a week, their cash was typically exhausted, and they were dependent on charity, on barter, or on the willingness of toll collectors to let them pass without payment. Toll collectors were not universally merciless. Medieval records contain plenty of evidence of toll keepers exercising discretion, letting through those who are clearly destitute, accepting barter goods in place of coin, or simply looking the other way as obviously starving people shuffled past a gate that they lacked the personnel to actually close. The Great Famine created a volume of road traffic that many toll systems simply could not have processed even if they had wanted to. To stop and interrogate and extract payment from every starving peasant on the road would have required more staff than most toll operations employed. But the discretion of individual toll collectors was not policy. It was the application of personal judgment in ambiguous circumstances, which meant it was inconsistent. A family turned away at one bridge, crossed 2 miles downstream at an uncontrolled ford, and arrived on the other side cold to the waist. A man who looked vigorous enough to be economically useful was stopped and made to work a day's labour for the toll-keeper's lord before being allowed to proceed. A woman travelling alone with young children was sometimes let through on the principle that she was manifestly incapable of being a security threat. Sometimes she was turned back on the principle that women travelling without male escort were suspect, whatever the circumstances. The road network itself was a landscape of variable threat. The main roads, the ancient routes connecting major towns, offered safety in numbers and the presence of other travellers as witnesses, but they also attracted the predators that a large, exhausted and resourceless travelling population would inevitably draw. Robbery was common. Medieval chronicles of the famine years mention repeatedly the presence of criminals on the main roads, taking from the desperate what little they still had. The smaller roads and forest paths that provided alternatives to the main routes were safer from human predators, but more dangerous in their own ways. They were harder to follow, especially in winter, when distinguishing a track from a field could be impossible under snow. They crossed territory where no monastery or market town lay within a day's walk, where the distance between potential sources of food was too great for a weakened body to cover safely. And they passed through woodland that was, in the famine years, being stripped of every edible thing by the thousands of people moving through it. Bark peeled from trees for a soup that provided almost no nutrition, early spring bulbs dug from frozen ground, the nests of birds raided for eggs that were not yet there. The road network was, in sum, simultaneously the only infrastructure that made famine migration possible, and a system thoroughly inadequate to the demands placed upon it. It was a medieval legacy in every sense, built for one purpose, repurposed by necessity, maintained by half measures and charity and the residual momentum of things constructed long ago by people with more resources and better plans. The migrants moved through it as best they could, adapting, improvising, finding their way through a system not designed for them, through a landscape that was eating itself, toward a horizon they could not be certain was real. The city was the destination. Not always. Sometimes the destination was a monastery or a large estate, or simply a place that was reported to have more food than the place you had left. But for many famine migrants, the city represented the end point of the calculation they had been making since they left home. Cities had markets, cities had craft guilds that employed people, cities had hospitals, run by the church, that offered food and shelter to the destitute. Cities had walls, which meant protection. Cities had something that the depleted countryside no longer reliably had: density, and the resources that density produced. The problem was that the cities did not necessarily want them. This is not a statement about medieval cruelty, though cruelty is part of the story. It is, more fundamentally, a statement about the economics of urban food supply. A medieval city fed itself through a sophisticated supply chain. Grain imported from the surrounding countryside through established merchant networks, supplemented by market gardens in the immediate hinterland, by fish from rivers and coasts, by preserved foods stocked in guild storerooms and wealthy household cellars. This supply chain was calibrated for the city's established population. It could absorb some additional demand. It could not absorb the kind of population surge that a major famine influx represented. City governments in the early 14th century were, by and large, more sophisticated and more capable of policy response than the rural jurisdictions from which the migrants came. The great Flemish cloth cities, Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, had municipal governments with functioning bureaucracies, the ability to levy taxes, control of the city's physical infrastructure, and the capacity to make and enforce collective decisions. Similar institutions existed in the major German trading cities, in the English provincial capitals, in the towns of northern France. These governments responded to the famine with measures that varied enormously in their effectiveness and their humanity. Some cities attempted to purchase emergency grain supplies from distant regions, using municipal funds or loans from the banking networks that were becoming increasingly important in early 14th century European commerce. Some imposed price controls on grain and bread, an intervention that pleased buyers but had the predictable effect of causing grain merchants to route their supplies away from price-controlled markets. Some established charitable distributions from municipal granaries, organised by the ward system through which medieval cities administered their populations. And many cities, most cities, at some point in the famine years, attempted to control the influx of migrants from the countryside. The mechanisms of exclusion were varied and sometimes inventive. Some cities required proof of residency, a document, a letter from a guild, evidence of an established connection to the town, before granting entry. This was not new policy. Medieval towns had long been careful about who they admitted as residents, for tax and guild regulation reasons. But in a famine year, it was applied with new urgency, and sometimes new severity. Documents were examined more carefully. Claimants who could not produce evidence of connection were turned away. Other cities allowed entry but restricted access to food distribution. The charitable systems that medieval towns operated, the hospitals, the bread doles, the guild arms, were typically organised around the parish system, and parish membership required residence. An incoming migrant who had no parish connection in the town could not easily access the distribution networks that the established poor already used. They might beg at church doors. They might receive occasional charity from individuals, but the systematic resources available to them were much thinner than those available to the town's own destitute. This distinction between the deserving local poor and the disruptive outsider poor appears repeatedly in medieval poor law thinking. The tension between these two categories of need is not unique to the medieval period. It recurs in every era that has to grapple with the arrival of large numbers of people fleeing scarcity. The established poor of a town had claims on local charity that were understood and accepted. The arriving migrant had needs that were in many ways more acute, but claims that were harder for the local community to process. The city was not entirely closed to migrants. That is the important qualification. Medieval urban society had mechanisms, however inadequate, for absorbing people from outside. Guild membership could be obtained eventually by outsiders who demonstrated skill and found masters willing to sponsor them. The hospitals and almshouses did distribute food and shelter to people regardless of residence, especially in crisis years when the sheer scale of need made any policy of strict exclusion practically unenforceable. The Church, which operated the largest charitable infrastructure in medieval Europe, had a theology of charity that made sharp distinctions of origin difficult to sustain at the individual level. And some cities, under the leadership of particularly capable or compassionate municipal governments, made active efforts to manage the famine influx humanely. The city of Ypres, one of the great cloth-producing cities of Flanders, established in the famine years a system of poor relief that was remarkable for its administrative sophistication, a census of the poor, a system of identifying those in most need, regular distributions managed by city officials rather than left to the randomness of individual charity. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was more than many places managed, and the people of Ypres who organised it did so in full awareness that the need vastly exceeded their capacity to meet it, and did it anyway with whatever they had. The city gates were not walls against compassion, they were walls against chaos. The distinction was hard to maintain when chaos wore the face of a starving child. The question of who counted as a legitimate object of charity in the medieval ethical system was more complicated than we might initially assume. The theology of charity was, in its formal articulation, relatively clear. The needy deserved help by virtue of their need, and the provider of charity received spiritual benefit in proportion to the generosity and selflessness of the giving. The model figure was always the same: Christ arriving as a stranger at the gate, disguised as a beggar, and the question of whether you recognized him in time. But the practical theology of charity, the system of ideas that actually governed behavior in a famine year, was considerably more nuanced. Medieval people distinguished between the deserving and the undeserving poor in ways that were institutionalized, culturally specific, and sometimes blatantly self-serving. The deserving poor were those whose poverty was visibly involuntary: the widow, the orphan, the disabled person, the person who had demonstrably fallen from better circumstances through no fault of their own. The undeserving poor were vagrants, people who chose to wander rather than work, people whose poverty was legible as moral failure rather than circumstantial misfortune. The famine migration complicated this distinction almost beyond use, because it produced millions of people who were simultaneously both categories at once: involuntarily impoverished by circumstances clearly beyond their control, and wandering on roads without fixed abode in a way that looked to casual observers exactly like the behaviour of the undeserving vagrant poor. The voluntary wanderer and the involuntary migrant looked alike on the road. They both had dirty clothes and no fixed address and an inability to prove their status to a sceptical gatekeeper. The municipal response to famine migration in the major European cities evolved over the course of the famine years in ways that reflect both the pressure of need and the learning capacity of medieval urban governments. The earliest responses were typically reactive. Existing charitable institutions, hospitals, monastery almshouses, guildoles, simply operated at increased capacity until they couldn't. The second phase of response was typically exclusionary, attempts to control who had access to charitable resources, to prioritize the local poor over the migrant poor, to maintain the existing system by restricting its scope. It was the third phase, where it emerged at all, that was genuinely innovative. The third phase involved recognizing that the existing system was inadequate, not just in its capacity, but in its design, and attempting to create new mechanisms specifically suited to the scale and nature of the crisis. This involved census-taking, systematic identification of the hungry rather than response to whoever showed up, and organized distribution rather than passive dole, and the use of municipal authority rather than exclusively ecclesiastical charity as the coordinating mechanism. The city of Bruges, one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated of the great Flemish cloth cities, developed something that approached a systematic famine response: municipal grain purchases organized through the city's merchant networks, distributions managed by ward officials rather than by the chance proximity of monastery or hospital, and an explicit attempt to distinguish between the city's settled poor, who received regular distributions, and the incoming migrant poor, who received emergency distributions at designated points outside the city gates. This was not generous. The migrant poor received less and more irregularly than the settled poor, and the outside the gates designation kept the visual disruption of mass destitution away from the commercial heart of the city. But it was more than most places managed, and it reflected a pragmatic decision by the city government that managing the famine was a municipal responsibility, not something that could be outsourced entirely to the church. The lord who deployed his resources well was not necessarily the lord with the most resources. Some of the most effective responses to the famine at the local manorial level came from middling landholders who combined modest resources with good judgment and genuine concern for the people on their land. They deferred rents when tenants could not pay. They opened their grain stores, not all at once, but carefully, rationing in ways designed to spread the benefit across the worst weeks of winter. They organized their bailiffs to keep track of who was in most need and to deliver grain to those who could not travel to collect it. These lords survive in the records partly because their tenants and their clerks wrote about them later, in memorial gifts to local churches, in legal documents that refer to the lord's actions in the famine years as the precedent for certain obligations. They survive because gratitude is a form of record-keeping, because people who are kept alive by a specific act of human decision tend to want that act acknowledged. The lords who did not respond generously also survive in the records, in a different register. The legal proceedings brought by their tenants for excessive distraint. The note in a chronicler's account of the famine years that certain lordships suffered particularly severe abandonment, tenants voting with their feet in the only way available to people who had no other mechanism of political expression. The estate accounts that show, in the stark language of medieval bookkeeping, that production fell in the famine years not only because of bad weather, but because there was no longer anyone left to work the fields. The famine was, among everything else it was, a performance review of the medieval social contract, and some of the people who administered that contract failed it, and some of them passed it, and the difference showed up in the landscape and the population, and the memory of the communities that came after. The markets of medieval Europe had never been designed with famine in mind, which is to say they had been designed without any mechanism for responding to the kind of supply collapse and demand surge that the famine produced simultaneously. The normal functioning of a medieval grain market assumed a relatively stable supply from the surrounding agricultural hinterland, sold by the producers or their agents at prices determined by the negotiation of the market itself, with the civic authorities intervening only at the margins to ensure honest weights and prevent the most egregious forms of fraud. What happened to grain markets in the famine years was not a dysfunction of the market system. It was the market system functioning exactly as designed in conditions the design had never anticipated. When supply collapsed and demand soared, prices rose. When prices rose to the point where most potential buyers could not afford to buy, the market cleared at those prices, selling to whoever could still afford the prevailing rate. The grain moved to the wealthy households that could afford it, to the monasteries with deep reserves, to the city governments with access to credit. The poor did not receive any of it, because the poor were not price-competitive buyers at a market price of 10 times the pre-famine norm. The market was working perfectly, the people were dying. The assize of bread, the medieval regulatory instrument that set maximum prices for bread in relation to the price of grain, was one of the few existing mechanisms through which civic authority could intervene in the market price of food. In England, the assize had been codified in legislation going back to the 12th century. It provided a sliding scale. As the price of grain rose, the size of the standard loaf, sold at a fixed price, was supposed to decrease proportionally, so that the price per unit of bread nutrition tracked the price of grain without the nominal price of a loaf changing. In theory, this protected poorer buyers by ensuring that bread remained purchasable, even as its nutritional content declined. In practice, the assize was chronically evaded and inadequately enforced. Bakers who were themselves buying grain at famine prices could not afford to sell bread at the assize rate and survive economically. They either ignored the assize and sold at market rates, or they reduced the loaf size below even the famine-adjusted assize standard, or they adulterated the bread with non-grain fillers, sawdust, chalk, clay, in quantities that were detectable but difficult to prove in a rapid market transaction. The authorities who were supposed to enforce the assize were overwhelmed. They were dealing with a crisis that spread their regulatory capacity across every dimension simultaneously. Price violations, fraud, hoarding, riot, the management of refugee populations, the maintenance of public order in cities where hungry people were pushing against the social fabric in every direction. Bread enforcement was important in principle. It was an administrative priority that kept getting displaced by more immediately pressing demands. The trade in grain across long distances was, in ordinary times, a marginal activity that supplemented local production rather than replacing it. The technology of medieval transportation, the ox cart on bad roads, the river barge on waterways that were not always navigable, made long-distance grain trade expensive in ways that narrowed the price differential at which it became profitable. In normal years, the difference between the price of grain in a surplus region and the price in a deficit region was usually not large enough after transport costs to make the trade commercially attractive. In famine years, the differential expanded dramatically, and the long-distance grain trade expanded with it. Italian merchant houses, the Verdi, the Peruzzi, the network of Florentine and Sienese trading companies that dominated international finance in the early 14th century, were active in the famine year grain trade, moving grain from the Baltic region and the Iberian Peninsula toward the most severely affected markets in Flanders and northern France. English wool merchants, whose networks of credit and transport extended across northern Europe, were similarly active. This international grain trade was the lifeline that prevented the famine from becoming even more catastrophic than it was. Baltic grain, rye from Poland and Prussia, transported by sea through the Hanseatic trading network, arrived in the Low Countries and northern France in significant quantities from 1316 onward, and this supply, while expensive and inadequate to the full scale of need, provided a margin that the purely local food system could not have generated. The people who could afford to buy this imported grain survived. The people who could not afford it continued to depend on what remained of the local charity system. The irony was visible and noted even at the time. Grain was moving across thousands of miles of sea and road, being bought and sold at prices that represented fortunes to the people who most needed it, while those people were dying within sight of the ships and the wagons that carried it. The market did not care. The market was not designed to care. The market was designed to match willing buyers and willing sellers at prices that both found acceptable. The dying were not willing buyers in any sense the market recognized. They were simply absent from the calculation. The rivers of medieval Europe were as important to the famine migration as the roads, and in some ways more so. A river was not just a water source and a geographical feature. It was a transport corridor, a boundary, a source of food in the form of fish, and in many regions the primary axis around which settlement and trade were organized. Following a river meant following the richest thread of the medieval landscape. The mills, the riverside markets, the bridge towns, the monastery churches set just above the flood line with their granaries and their history of hospitality. Famine migrants followed rivers the way water follows them, downhill toward the sea, toward the densest accumulations of human activity and the resources those accumulations represented. The Rhine carried people west toward Cologne and the Low Countries. The Schelde and the Maas drained the Flemish plain toward the coast and its trading cities. The Thames pulled movement toward London, the Seine toward Paris. These convergences at river confluences and bridgeheads were some of the most intense concentrations of famine need in the whole period, places where multiple streams of migration arrived simultaneously, where the infrastructure of bridge and mill and monastery was already overwhelmed before each new wave arrived, where the competition for scarce resources was sharpest and the likelihood of violence highest. And yet the rivers were also, paradoxically, among the most productive foraging environments available to famine migrants. A river held fish, and fish were a significant caloric resource for people who could catch them. The right to fish was jealously guarded by lords and monasteries. Rivers were property as much as land was, and the fish in them were somebody's fish. But the enforcement of fishing rights was even harder than the enforcement of the bread assize in conditions of mass need. People starving on a riverbank will catch fish from a river, regardless of who the fish legally belong to. The evidence of illegal fishing in the famine records is extensive, and the punishment seems, in most documented cases, to have been light or non-existent. Even the most legally punctilious medieval lord apparently understood that prosecuting a starving widow for catching a fish from his river was unlikely to end well. The monasteries were the welfare state of medieval Europe. This is not a romantic overstatement. The monastic system, the Benedictine houses, the Cistercian abbeys, the Franciscan friaries, the Augustinian convents, the dozens of other orders and houses distributed across the European landscape, constituted the most extensive and most systematic welfare infrastructure that medieval society possessed. Their charity was theologically motivated and often deeply personal in its mode of operation, but in its scale and its reach, it performed functions that we would now recognize as public services: healthcare, education, emergency food distribution, shelter for travellers. The foundation of monastic charity was the rule of St. Benedict, which devoted specific chapters to the treatment of guests, everyone from wealthy benefactors making donations to pilgrims to the sick, to the indigent stranger at the gate. The guest was to be received as Christ himself, the rule commanded. The abbot was to wash the feet of poor guests and give them special attention, because the wealthy would demand attention on their own behalf, while the attention given to the poor was given freely. In normal years, monastic charity operated on a manageable scale. A Benedictine house of 40 monks might distribute food daily at its gate to a few dozen regular poor from the surrounding area: elderly people, the disabled, widows with small children, wandering scholars. It was a predictable demand that the monastery could plan for, sourcing food from its own agricultural holdings, which were typically extensive and well managed by the standards of the time. The Great Famine did not merely increase this predictable demand, It destroyed the relationship between the monastery's food production capacity and the number of people who needed to eat. The monastery's fields were subject to the same weather as everyone else's. The harvests of 1315 and 1316 failed for monasteries, as they failed for peasants, though monasteries typically had larger reserves and more sophisticated storage systems, which meant their failure came later and was initially less absolute. But by 1317 and 1318, even the best-stocked monastic granaries were running low, and at their gates, the numbers were not dozens, they were hundreds. The chronicles are explicit about this. Monks writing from inside the walls describe queues that extended beyond sight, that backed up along the road for miles, that included people who had already been on the road for days or weeks and arrived in such a condition that charity from the monastery was the last possible chance before death. The monastic response to this overwhelming need was varied and reveals the limits of an institution built for a different scale of crisis. Some houses continued distributing to all comers until their supplies were exhausted, at which point they had nothing left, not even enough to feed their own community through the winter. A few monasteries recorded what appeared to be complete cessations of charity as their granaries emptied, the gate closed, the almonry dark, the crowd turning away to the next reported source. Others made more calculated decisions. They continued to feed their regular poor, the local dependent population they had been supporting for years, and refused or reduced distributions to the migrant outsiders who arrived at the gate. This was not callousness. It was triage. The calculation was explicit. The monastery could feed 100 people through the winter, or it could give everything it had to the first 500 people who arrived and leave the regular poor with nothing. Some houses made different calculations still. The records of the Abbey of Saint-Denis in northern France show distributions in 1316 and 1317 that exhausted the monastery's grain reserves entirely, leaving the community dependent on emergency purchases from Italian banking houses at prices that were still being paid off decades later. The decision, effectively to bankrupt the institution for the sake of the starving at its gate, was made by an abbot whose name we still have, and whose decision leaves a trace in the financial records that is more eloquent than any chronicle passage. The Franciscans and Dominicans, the mendicant orders founded in the early 13th century, who operated primarily in cities rather than rural estates, faced a different version of the same crisis. The Franciscans, in particular, had embedded themselves deeply in the urban poor communities of medieval Europe. Their friaries were in the poorest quarters of cities. Their identity was specifically defined by voluntary poverty. Their relationship with the urban destitute was not institutional charity at arm's length, but personal, visceral, and practically daily. In the famine years, Franciscan houses became centres of desperation in the cities, as the monasteries had become in the countryside. People who had reached a town and been unable to find food or shelter from any other source arrived at the Franciscan gate as a last resort, and the Franciscans, true to their founding spirit, often to an impractical extreme, gave what they had until they had nothing. Brother Salimbene de Adam, a 13th century Franciscan chronicler whose writings capture the texture of mendicant life with unusual vividness, left accounts of famine conditions that read with the immediacy rare in medieval sources. He describes friars going out into the streets to bring in people too weak to walk. He describes the fraternities of lay people associated with Franciscan houses, giving their own food in addition to the friary's stores. He describes a community organized around the principle that the emergency was real, and the response had to be proportionate to the emergency, even if it meant destituting themselves. The monasteries and friaries of medieval Europe did not solve the Great Famine. No institution could have solved it. What they provided was something different, and, in the context of the Hunger Road, perhaps equally important, they provided destinations. They gave the migration a geography. They were the points on the map toward which the stories circulated and the feet pointed, and the hope, thin and persistent as a winter weed, kept growing. To know that there was a Cistercian house 2 days' walk east, that a Franciscan friary had been distributing in the city ahead, was to have a reason to keep walking. The monasteries were the anchors of a care network that was completely inadequate to the scale of what was asked of it. And they were irreplaceable. In a landscape stripped of almost everything else, they remained. Their bells still ringing, their gates still opening some mornings, their dispensations still being recorded in ledgers by monks who would live to see the famine end and would spend the rest of their lives wondering if they had done enough. The economy that emerged on the Hunger Road and at its destinations was not the economy of normal medieval life. It was a shadow economy, running parallel to the official markets and the guild-regulated craft trades and the manorial rent systems, operating on different principles and different currencies. In this shadow economy, the primary currency was not coin. Most migrants had no coin, but need and its corresponding resource. What you had to trade was your ability to work, your possession of any skill, the physical objects you had carried from home, and your body's remaining capacity. What you received in exchange was food, shelter, safe passage, or information about where any of those things might be found further on. The labour exchange was the most straightforward form. A strong man or woman who arrived at a monastery or a large estate with the capacity for a day's hard work could trade that work for a meal and perhaps a night in a barn. This was not new. Casual labour markets existed throughout medieval Europe, but in the famine years, the supply side of the labour market was massively expanded, while the demand side was constrained. So many people needed work and so few operations had work to give that the price of a day's labour declined toward the absolute minimum, enough food to sustain the labourer through the day. Craft skills were a different kind of currency. A trained craftsperson, a cobbler, a weaver, a blacksmith, carried a portable capital that did not require physical strength and did not deplete as fast as the body's energy reserves. In a town that needed leather repaired, a cobbler could negotiate for more than one day's food at a time. In a village that had lost its smith to the road, a blacksmith who showed up and demonstrated competence could sometimes negotiate for winter shelter and a regular food supply in exchange for work. This was not guaranteed. The towns were full of craftspeople already, and many of the migrant craftspeople arrived in a condition that made sustained skilled work difficult. But the principle held. Skill was a form of capital that travelled, and in the famine years, the ability to do a specific thing well was among the most valuable possessions a person could carry on the road. The objects people carried were a more complicated kind of currency. Some things, good tools, warm cloth, metal items, had genuine exchange value. But the asset liquidation that had preceded most people's departure meant that most of what they carried when they left had already been sold before departure. What remained on the road was typically the least valuable remainder: worn clothing, personal items with sentimental rather than market value, fragments of things that had been useful at home but were not useful on the road. The market for religious objects was a particular feature of famine migration economics. Medieval people carried relics, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of cloth that had touched a holy image, small carved figures, as a matter of ordinary piety, and these objects had both spiritual and commercial value. In a society in which the boundary between the sacred and the economic was more porous than we tend to imagine, a relic could be offered as collateral for a loan, sold outright to a buyer who wanted spiritual protection, or donated to a shrine in exchange for the monastery's hospitality. The trade in religious objects during the famine years was extensive enough that it became a source of concern for the church. Bishops issued regulations warning against fraudulent relics. Not a new concern, but one with new urgency when starvation was providing powerful motivation for fraud. A convincing piece of supposed saint's bone could feed a family for weeks. The temptation to manufacture convincing pieces of supposed saint's bone was, under those circumstances, not difficult to understand. More troubling still, and documented with uncomfortable specificity in a handful of chronicles, was the market in children. The abandonment of children at monastery gates and church doors was not new to the medieval period. The practice had been documented since antiquity, and the church had elaborate systems for managing foundlings. What the famine years produced was an escalation in scale that overwhelmed those systems. Some churches and monasteries recorded receiving dozens of infants in a single day. They could not all be cared for. The mortality rate among foundlings in famine years was catastrophic. Some parents did not abandon children to the mercy of institutions, they sold them. Medieval Europe had a residual slave trade, suppressed by the church, condemned by authorities, but never fully eliminated, and in the famine years, the market for child labourers expanded. A child sold to a relatively prosperous household as a servant had at least a chance of eating. The economics were terrible. The alternatives were sometimes worse. Some parents gave children away, gave them to better-fed relatives, to neighbouring households, to travellers who seem to have resources. A family with 5 children and food for 2 will sometimes make a calculation that distributes the surviving chance more widely than keeping everyone together. These decisions were not made easily or without grief. They were made when every other option was exhausted. The most extreme survival behaviours documented in the famine chronicles remain, even 7 centuries later, difficult to read. The consumption of dogs and cats and the vermin that infested grain stores was common and not remarkable. The consumption of grass and bark and roots was documented across the famine region and represents a sophisticated, if nutritionally inadequate, attempt to extract calories from the available environment. The consumption of human flesh, recorded in several independent chronicles from the famine years, represents the terminal failure of every other option. The accounts are specific enough and distributed enough across independent sources that most historians consider them credible, while emphasizing that they represent extreme outliers even within the catastrophic conditions of the worst famine years. They are recorded not as commonplace events, but as shocking ones, evidence of a situation so far outside the bounds of normal human experience that it had forced behaviour outside the bounds of what normal human beings did. Medieval people understood what they were witnessing in these events. They found words for it. The Latin sources used terms that convey horror and sometimes explicit theological reference to hell and the end times. The famine was, for those living through it, not just a catastrophe, but a sign, evidence that the world was badly broken, that something had failed at a level deeper than agricultural weather, that God's creation was expressing something terrible about the state of human affairs. And yet, through all of it, people continued to care for each other. The mother who sold a child was the same woman who had carried that child for months, on a body with almost nothing left. The monk who closed the gate when supplies ran out was the same monk who had given everything he had until that moment. The tollkeeper who let people through without payment was doing something that the lord who owned his position had specifically forbidden him to do. The economy of desperation ran on more than transaction. It ran on the residual, battered, sometimes barely visible persistence of human decency in conditions designed to destroy it. And it is perhaps that persistence, small, inconsistent, unequal to what was asked of it but present, that is the most important thing about the Hunger Road. The lords of medieval Europe held, in theory, the resources that could have mitigated the worst effects of the Great Famine. The manorial system that organised most of northern European rural society placed enormous concentrations of agricultural land, grain stores and organisational capacity in the hands of a relatively small class of landholders. The great barons, the lesser knights and squires, the ecclesiastical landowners who held their estates in temporal lordship. If any of those resources had been systematically deployed toward famine relief, the outcome of the famine years might have been, if not different in its ultimate causes, significantly less catastrophic in its human consequences. They were not for the most part so deployed. Understanding why requires understanding how the manorial system worked and how the famine interacted with the specific economic incentives it created. The fundamental bargain of the manorial system was this: the peasant owed the lord labour, work on the lord's domain for a specified number of days per week, and rents, payments in cash or kind, usually grain. In return, the lord owed the peasant, theoretically at least, protection from external violence, from the courts, from the administrative demands of the larger political world, and access to the lord's common resources, the mill, the forest, the common pasture. The famine shattered this bargain from both ends simultaneously. Peasants who could not pay their rents because there was no grain to pay them with were defaulting on their obligations to the lord. Peasants who abandoned their holdings entirely were removing the labour from the domain that the lord depended on for his own income. At the same time, the lord's own domain harvests were failing, his stored grain depleting, his ability to maintain his household and his military obligations to his own superiors coming under severe pressure. This meant that many lords, particularly the smaller ones with limited resources, responded to the famine not by deploying their reserves to help their tenants, but by intensifying their extraction from those tenants in an attempt to compensate for declining domain income. Rent arrears were pursued aggressively. Tenants who fell into default were subjected to legal proceedings. Peasants who had abandoned holdings and returned to them found that the lord had in their absence regranted the land to someone else, or had distrained their tools and animals as security for unpaid obligations. Some lords responded differently, and the documentary record is specific enough to identify them. The magnate who opened his granaries to the surrounding population, the knight who deferred rent collection for 2 seasons, the ecclesiastical lord who organised systematic food distribution from the church's estate. These appear in the chronicles, sometimes by name, as specific counterexamples to the general pattern of extraction. What distinguished them? The evidence is fragmentary, but a few patterns emerge. Ecclesiastical lords, bishops and abbots managing estates that were formerly dedicated to charitable purposes, were significantly more likely than lay lords to engage in systematic relief, partly because their institutional theology required it, and partly because they faced scrutiny from a church hierarchy that cared about the question. Great magnates with diversified holdings across many regions were better positioned to practice relief in one region by drawing on surpluses from others. It was the smaller lords, with resources entirely concentrated in a single failing locality, who had the least capacity for generosity. And some lords simply saw the pragmatic case for keeping their tenants alive. A holding without tenants produced no rents. A tenant who died of famine was a permanent revenue loss. A tenant who was kept alive through a hard winter by a lord's grain distribution would return to work in the spring and be able to pay rents for years to come. This calculation, relief as investment, was not humanitarian in its motivation, but it produced humanitarian results, and it appears explicitly in some manorial correspondence of the period. The response of the great aristocratic and royal powers, the kings and princes and great barons who commanded the largest concentrations of resources in medieval society, was shaped by a different set of political considerations. For these powers, the famine was not only a humanitarian crisis but a political one. Hungry populations were unstable populations. Hungry populations rioted, stole, migrated in ways that disrupted tax collection and military recruitment and the ordinary functioning of governance. The political responses of medieval states to the Great Famine varied enormously. Some kings made genuine efforts to control grain prices and prevent hoarding, issuing ordinances against forestalling, the practice of buying grain before it reached the public market in order to sell it at higher prices, and a size of bread regulations that specified what prices bakers could charge. These regulations were difficult to enforce and frequently circumvented, but their existence indicates at least an awareness that the state had a role in managing food markets. Other royal responses were more focused on managing the political consequences of hunger than on addressing its causes. The suppression of riot, the great food riots that broke out in Flemish cities, in English towns, in the markets of northern France, absorbed considerable royal and municipal attention in the famine years. These riots were not the disorganized rampages of hungry mobs that contemporary sources sometimes describe them as. They were often targeted specific attacks on grain merchants accused of hoarding, on municipal granaries whose distribution was perceived as unfair, on the homes of wealthy individuals who were visibly well fed while their neighbours starved. The political geography of hunger was, in other words, as complicated as its physical geography. The hunger road ran through a landscape of power as much as a landscape of roads and fields, and the power that it encountered, helpful sometimes, indifferent often, actively hostile occasionally, shaped the possibilities available to the people moving through it. Medieval people lived in a world that was saturated with God, not in the vague, background way that many people in contemporary secular societies might describe their spiritual lives, but in a total, specific, practically navigable way. The theological framework of medieval Christianity was not merely a set of beliefs about what happened after death. It was a comprehensive explanatory system that accounted for weather, disease, political events, personal misfortune, and every other significant feature of earthly life. And it had a very clear explanation for famine. Famine, in the medieval theological framework, was not a natural disaster, or rather, it was not merely a natural disaster, it was a judgment. It was what happened when a population, or a lord, or a kingdom, had sinned sufficiently to draw the punishing attention of a God who was. The theology was explicit about this, attentive to human behaviour and fully capable of expressing displeasure through the operations of the natural world. The evidence for this explanation was not merely traditional, it was, for many medieval people, experiential. They had grown up in a world where the connection between moral behaviour and agricultural outcome was asserted repeatedly, in sermons, in saints' lives, in the providential history laid out in the Old Testament, which medieval people knew well and read as directly applicable to their own situation. The Israelites had been rewarded with harvest and punished with drought in direct response to their faithfulness or their sin. Medieval Europeans had no reason to believe they operated under a different dispensation. The penitential response to the famine was immediate, organised and extensive. Bishops ordered fasts, which had a certain bitter irony in a population that was already involuntarily starving. But the theological point was that the fasting had to be voluntary and intentional to count as penance. They organised rogation processions, formal ambulatory prayers through the landscape, petitioning God and the saints for relief. They commissioned special masses, votive offices for the cessation of bad weather, intercessions addressed to the particular saints who were understood to have jurisdiction over agricultural matters. The saints of the famine period absorbed an enormous amount of theological attention. St. Medard, the 6th century bishop associated with rain, his feast day June 8th, was held to predict the summer's weather in the same way that Groundhog Day functions in American folk meteorology, received particular attention in French-speaking regions. St. Nicholas, protector of the poor, was invoked across a wider geography. St. Isidore the farmer, recently canonized, was a direct address to the specific problem of failed crops. None of these intercessions made the rain stop. The theological crisis that the failure of intercession produced was not, for most medieval people, a crisis of faith in God's existence. It was a crisis in their understanding of what they had done wrong. If God was punishing them, and the punishment continued despite penitence and prayer and procession, then either their penitence was insufficient, or their understanding of what required repentance was incomplete. The answers that medieval ecclesiastical authority proposed tended to be expansive and intensifying. You have not prayed enough, fasted enough, given enough to the poor, repented sincerely enough. The implication was that the famine could be ended by greater spiritual effort, a message that was simultaneously comforting because it located the cause within human agency, and torturing because it implied that ongoing suffering was a measure of ongoing spiritual failure. Heresy and heterodox religious movements flourished in this atmosphere, as they tend to flourish whenever official theological explanations fail to account for the scale of human suffering. The Free Spirit movement, which flourished in the Rhineland and Low Countries in the early 14th century, offered a radical alternative to the penitential framework, the idea that the individual soul could achieve union with God and thus escape the cycles of sin and punishment that official theology described. This was theologically alarming to church authorities. If you were already unified with God, the institutional church with its sacraments and its penitential systems became unnecessary, and it was appealing to precisely the populations that official theology was failing most visibly. Flagellant movements, organised groups of laypeople who publicly flogged themselves as extreme penance, travelling in processions from town to town, would become much more widespread after the Black Death a generation later, but their roots were already visible in the famine years. The logic of flagellantism was an intensification of the penitential framework. If ordinary penance was insufficient, extraordinary penance was required. The public spectacle of self-inflicted suffering served simultaneously as personal penance and as communal witness to the seriousness of the moment. The Church was ambivalent about flagellant movements. Their theology was sound in its basic penitential premise, but their organisational autonomy, groups of lay people performing quasi-sacramental functions without clerical oversight, made church authorities deeply nervous. The famine years saw repeated episcopal attempts to manage and channel this energy toward approved forms of collective penance, with mixed success. Beneath all of this institutional and theological activity, at the level of the ordinary person on the hunger road, something simpler and more immediate was happening. People were asking questions that theology had not prepared them to ask, or rather, had prepared them to ask in terms that no longer felt adequate to the answers they were being given. Why my child? Why this winter? Why this road? Why the prayers that have not stopped the rain? The medieval theological system had answers to these questions. The answers were true within the framework that produced them, and many people received them with the gratitude of someone given language for a pain they could not otherwise articulate. But the answers also required a particular kind of submission, to the inscrutable but purposive will of a God who knew what you deserved, even when you could not see it yourself, that not everyone on the hunger road could maintain. And in the gap between the theology and the experience, something was changing, something that would, over the course of the 14th century, begin to reshape the relationship between European people and their institutional church in ways that would take another 2 centuries to become fully visible. The Great Famine did not cause the Reformation, but it opened the questions. The pilgrimage as a response to famine is worth dwelling on, because it occupied a peculiar position in the landscape of medieval survival strategy. Pilgrimage was, in formal terms, a religious act, a journey undertaken in fulfillment of a vow, or as a penitential exercise, or in pursuit of the healing that proximity to a saint's relics was believed to confer. But in the context of a famine, pilgrimage acquired additional dimensions that complicated its purely spiritual character. A pilgrimage destination was a food source. The great pilgrimage shrines of medieval Europe, Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, Cologne, the smaller regional shrines whose importance was measured in hours of travel rather than weeks, were magnets for charitable infrastructure. Hospitals, hospices, almshouses clustered around them. The pilgrimage economy depended on pilgrims, and dead pilgrims contributed nothing to the local economy, so the institutions surrounding major shrines had strong pragmatic motivation to keep pilgrims alive, which meant feeding them. A famine migrant who reframed herself as a pilgrim, who adopted the pilgrim's symbolic apparatus of staff and scrip and the cockle shell or palm branch that indicated pilgrimage status, gained access to this charitable infrastructure. She also gained a different social status on the road. The pilgrim was a recognized, legitimate category of traveller with established rites of passage and hospitality that the mere migrant did not possess. The transformation from refugee to pilgrim required only the right objects, the right posture, and the willingness to say the right words at the right gates. The records of English pilgrimage shrines in the famine years show notable increases in the volume of visitors, and in the proportion of visitors who required charitable rather than commercial accommodation. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury, which normally handled a large volume of prosperous pilgrims who paid for their lodging and added to the shrine's income, in the famine years received a significantly increased proportion of pauper pilgrims who paid nothing and required feeding. The shrine accounts for these years show the charitable budget increasing substantially, while the commercial pilgrimage income declined. A double squeeze that the shrine's administration managed apparently by drawing on reserves and by making explicit appeals to the wealthier pilgrims who did attend to contribute extra for the support of their less fortunate fellow travellers. The theology of pilgrimage, which held that all pilgrims were equal before God and before the saint they were petitioning regardless of their earthly status, was a genuine levelling force on the pilgrimage road. A great lord and a starving peasant, both kneeling before the same reliquary, were in the same position before the object of their shared veneration. This was not social equality. They would return to very different lives if they survived the pilgrimage, but it was a form of symbolic equality that had practical consequences for how the road operated and how the hospitality infrastructure along it was organised. The journey itself, for a famine pilgrim, was often physically indistinguishable from ordinary famine migration. You walked the same roads, encountered the same obstacles, faced the same dangers. What was different was the framework you carried it in, the meaning you assigned to the suffering, the destination you identified, the community you belonged to on the road. The pilgrim on a famine road was still hungry, and still tired, and still frightened. But the hunger had a name in the framework of the pilgrimage. It was penance, or testing, or the imitation of Christ's suffering, or the condition of the apostles. The suffering was the same, its meaning was different. Whether that different meaning made the suffering more or less bearable is a question that the sources cannot fully answer, and perhaps one that has no single answer that holds across the range of individual temperaments and circumstances the famine road contained. For some people, the framework clearly helped. The sense that the suffering had purpose, that it was oriented towards something, that it placed the individual within a narrative larger than their own immediate crisis. For others, one suspects, the formal religious framework was a thin layer over the raw reality of a starving body and a dead village, and a child who had stopped speaking. What the famine ultimately taught the survivors, and taught the institutions that administered their world, was a lesson about the relationship between the individual and the collective that ran counter to some of the most deeply held assumptions of medieval social thought. Medieval social thought, in its dominant theological formulation, held that the social hierarchy was divinely ordained, that the arrangement of people into lords and peasants and clergy, each in their appropriate place and fulfilling their appropriate function, was part of the created order and not subject to fundamental revision by human decision. This was not merely an ideology of the powerful, it was genuinely believed, at various levels of conviction, by many of the people at the bottom of the hierarchy as well, the peasant who prayed for his lord's soul, who expected his lord's protection in return for his labour, who participated in the liturgical life of a church that preached the eternal significance of earthly social arrangements. This person was not simply the victim of a false consciousness imposed from outside. He was a participant in a shared system of meaning that had served, however imperfectly, as the framework within which medieval social life made sense. The famine shook this framework without quite overturning it. It demonstrated, concretely and unmistakably, that lords could fail their obligations without divine consequences, that the Church could claim divine authority for explanations that did not match the experience of the people receiving them, that the social system was not a mechanism of divine providence, but a human construction subject to human failure. This demonstration did not produce immediate revolution. The structures were too deeply embedded, the alternatives too poorly articulated, but it sowed the seeds of a critical distance from the social order that would, over the following century and a half, gradually produce new forms of political consciousness and new demands for social accountability. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 is often analysed in terms of its immediate triggers, the poll tax, the labour legislation that tried to restore pre-plague wage levels. But behind those immediate triggers was a peasantry that had, across the 14th century, accumulated experience and vocabulary for the assessment of power. The hunger road was part of that accumulated experience, the memory, passed down through the generation that had walked it, of what it looked like when the social contract failed, and what resources a person possessed when everything the social contract had promised was gone. You have your feet, you have the road, you have the names of the places where people said there might be food. And you walk. The road ended. For most migrants, it ended somewhere, eventually, even if not at the destination they had originally intended. The records of arrival, the documents that track what happened to famine migrants who reached the towns and monasteries and estates that were their destinations, are fragmentary and partial. Medieval record-keeping was not designed to follow people across jurisdictions. When a refugee family arrived in a new town, they did not register with a municipal authority. There was no census that counted them. They entered the historical record only when they did something that drew official attention, when they were arraigned for begging without license, when they enrolled in a guild, when they appeared in a parish register as a baptism or a burial, when they were party to a legal dispute. From these scattered traces, a picture of arrival can be assembled, and it is a picture of enormous variation. A substantial minority of migrants never reached their intended destination. They died on the road, or they stopped when their strength ran out, or they turned back when the stories proved false and the monastery gate was shut. The mortality rate of the hunger road was high, higher than that of the populations who stayed in place, because the road combined the physical stresses of hunger and cold with the added demands of sustained travel and the particular susceptibility to disease that proximity to large numbers of other people created. A column of famine migrants was, immunologically speaking, a disaster in motion. People with compromised immune systems in close physical contact with strangers from other disease environments, sharing the same water sources, the same sheltered spaces, the same air. The dysentery and typhus that killed so many during the Great Famine spread most efficiently through exactly these conditions. Medieval sources describe the roads in the worst years as literally strewn with the dead, not as metaphor but as practical logistical fact. Who buried the dead on the road was a serious question. The parishes whose territory the road crossed had a theoretical obligation to bury the dead within their boundaries, but the scale of famine mortality made this obligation impossible to meet in a dignified way, and mass graves were dug at roadsides to receive what no one had the resources to process individually. For those who survived the road, arrival was often not the resolution it had been imagined to be. The towns and monasteries that had been the destinations of hope frequently disappointed. The grain had run out, the distribution had been suspended, The lord who was said to be generous had died or been replaced or simply never been what the stories described. Arriving migrants who found their expected resources depleted had to reassess, move on again, try a different approach, fall back on whatever the local environment could provide. Some became seasonal migrants. They came to a town or a monastery in the most desperate months, midwinter when the roads were worst and the hunger was most acute, and returned to their home territories in spring, when the possibility of planting or scavenging something from the land re-emerged. This seasonal oscillation appears in the records of several English and Flemish towns, where the number of people seeking charity at the hospital gate showed a clear winter peak and a spring-summer trough. Some of the same individuals appear to have made this journey multiple times over the course of the famine years. The migrants who successfully settled in new places left the most difficult traces to find, because successful settlement meant, by definition, disappearing into the fabric of the new community. A man who arrived in a Flemish cloth town in 1317 and was hired as a weaver's assistant, and in due course became a weaver himself and joined the guild and married a local woman, and had children, and paid his guild dues. This man is invisible as a migrant. He became, in time, a townsman. His origin is not recorded in the documents that track his later life. Only if something went wrong, a legal dispute, a query about citizenship rights, a reference to his status as a newcomer in a guild petition, would his origin become visible. This invisibility is itself significant. It means that the famine migration was much more successful, in its ultimate outcome, than the roadside mortality and the closed gates and the disappointed destinations might suggest. Many of the people who left the depleted countryside of northern Europe in the famine years did eventually find somewhere to go. They were absorbed, awkwardly, partially, not without difficulty on both sides, into the existing communities of towns and estates and monasteries. They brought skills and labour, and in some cases new ideas about craft techniques or agricultural practices from the regions they had come from. Not everyone was absorbed. Some migrant communities remained identifiably distinct within their host societies for generations, maintaining a distinct dialect or a particular craft association, or a neighbourhood that preserved the identity of the people who had first settled it in the famine years. The history of European urbanization is full of these traces, communities of people who came from somewhere else and remembered it, and wove the memory into the texture of the place they had made new. And some migrants simply disappeared. The record goes blank. They left home, they entered the road, and then they are not found in any subsequent document in the place they came from or the place they were going to. Perhaps they died. Perhaps they settled somewhere so thoroughly that no trace remains. Perhaps they went somewhere that no record keeper of the period was watching closely enough to note. They walked into history's gaps and stayed there. The gaps are large. They contain multitudes. The children of the famine were, as all children of disaster are, the most vulnerable and the most resilient simultaneously. Vulnerable because their developing bodies had the least capacity to withstand nutritional deprivation and disease. Resilient because children have in general more physiological flexibility than adults, more capacity to recover function after adequate nutrition is restored, more psychological adaptability to change circumstances. But the psychological adaptability of children is not infinite, and it is not free. What the famine did to the children who survived it, what it deposited in their nervous systems and their emotional frameworks and their understanding of the world, did not disappear when the harvest improved. It became part of who they were, part of the particular way they held themselves in relation to food, to institutions, to the people who had authority over their survival. The medieval world did not have the concept of childhood trauma in any articulated sense. It had the observation, which appears in several sources, that the children who had been through the worst of the famine years were, in their later lives, recognizably different from those who had not. Quieter, some accounts suggest, more careful with food, less trusting of institutional promise, more tightly bonded to the small group of people, family, immediate community, whose capacity to help them they had had reason to trust. The women of the famine were, in a different way, the most complex subject that the historical record leaves us. The specific burdens that fell on women in the famine years were not the same as those that fell on men, and the historical sources, written overwhelmingly by men organized around the concerns of the institutions that men ran, are least adequate to the reality of women's experience. What we can piece together suggests that women bore a disproportionate weight of the famine's immediate domestic consequences. They were the ones who managed the household food supply, deciding who ate how much, deciding when the last reserves were gone, deciding what came next when the ordinary sources failed. They were the ones who stretched the food, the technology of famine cooking, the ways of making small amounts of nutritionally inadequate material into something that could be distributed to children. The skill of feeding a family on what could not technically feed a family rested primarily with women. They were also, in many cases, the ones who made the decision to abandon children or to send children away, and who lived with the consequences of those decisions in ways that the historical record doesn't follow, but can be imagined. A mother who gave a child to a monastery to be a foundling, or to a neighbour who seemed better placed to keep the child alive, carried that decision for the rest of her life, regardless of whether the decision was the right one, and regardless of what came after. The recovery from famine, when it came, was not uniform across the populations that had experienced it. The wealthy recovered quickly, because the famine, while reducing their comfortable margins, had not fundamentally depleted their capital. The well-fed and the well-connected emerged from the famine years with fewer resources than they had entered them, but with the organisational and financial capacity to rebuild. The formerly comfortable smallholder, who had sold his land and his animals and his tools, and who now worked for wages on the estate of someone who had bought those assets at distress prices, did not recover in the same way. He had descended permanently from a status that involved property and relative autonomy to one that involved neither. The famine had accomplished what years of ordinary economic pressure had not: the conversion of a small independent proprietor into a landless wage labourer. He ate again after the famine. He did not get his land back. This transformation from small proprietor to labourer was one of the structural effects of the famine that most clearly shaped the subsequent decades of European economic history. The concentration of land in fewer hands, the displacement of the peasant smallholder by the larger state working hired labour, the reduction in the proportion of the rural population that held productive property. These are trends visible in European agrarian history across the 14th century, and the Great Famine accelerated all of them. The irony is that the Black Death, arriving less than 30 years later, partially reversed these trends by creating a labour shortage so severe that it restored the bargaining power of the surviving labouring poor in ways that the famine had helped to destroy. The 14th century gave and took away with both hands, as centuries tend to do. The monasteries that had survived the famine, most of them, though not without damage, emerged from the crisis changed in their understanding of their role. The experience of being overwhelmed, of giving everything they had and watching it prove insufficient, of closing gates that their own theology told them should remain open. This experience left traces in the way the major orders thought about charity and institutional capacity in the decades after the famine. The gradual development, across the 14th and 15th centuries, of more systematic approaches to poor relief, the municipal systems that Bruges and Ypres had pioneered in the famine years being adopted and refined in more cities, was not unconnected to the famine's demonstration that informal charity at the institutional level could not scale to meet mass need. Something more organised was required, something with a census and a budget and an accountability structure, something that looked, in retrospect, like the early architecture of the welfare state. The Church's role in this evolution was complex. It did not relinquish its position as the primary institutional provider of charity easily or quickly. But the scale of the famine's need and the visibility of the Church's inadequacy in meeting it planted seeds of an argument that would grow across the following centuries, the argument that the care of the poor was too important to be left entirely to the voluntary and irregular mechanisms of religious charity, and that secular authority had both the right and the responsibility to organise it. That argument would eventually become the dominant framework of European poor relief. It would take 3 more centuries to fully displace the ecclesiastical model, but it was, in a meaningful sense, born on the hunger road of the early 14th century in the queue at the monastery gate that stretched further than the gate could see. The winter of 1317 to 1318 was the worst winter of the famine years by most measures, the coldest, the longest, and the one that fell on populations most severely depleted by 2 prior years of inadequate nutrition. By this point, the people who were going to leave their home communities had largely left them. The people still on the roads were those who had been travelling the longest, whose reserves, physical, financial, psychological, were most deeply exhausted, and the places that were their destinations had been receiving migrants for 2 years, and were themselves running short. It was in this winter that the mortality on the roads peaked. Medieval chronicles describing the roads of January and February 1318 read, in places, like battlefield reports, the numbers of dead found at roadside resting places, in the approaches to town gates, beneath bridges and in the angles of walls where the wind was slightly less. The numbers are difficult to verify. Medieval chroniclers writing about mass death tend toward round numbers and conventional expressions of horror that served rhetorical as much as documentary purposes, but the pattern is consistent across independent sources. The winter of 1317 to 1318 was the winter that the road's toll was highest. And yet even in this worst winter people arrived. The monastery gates opened some mornings to distribute what was left. The hospice near the bridge kept its fire going. The woman who had been feeding people from her own diminishing stores, not because she had enough, but because she was the kind of person who did this, who had always done this, and who could not stop doing it simply because the need had become larger than the resource, continued to open her door. The hunger road was not only what it took, it was also what it brought out, in the people who kept the gates open, who stayed at their stations past the point of reasonable expectation, who treated the strangers at their door with the same consideration they would have given neighbours. These people are in the record too, less dramatically than the dead on the road, but present and insistent, and worth naming even when their names are gone. The woman who shared her last bread, the monk who gave his cloak to a man with nothing, the toll-keeper who waved through everyone all winter without recording what he was doing, at what cost to his own position, the miller who ground grain at below-cost rates for the people who brought him their last small amounts of remaining seed, the teacher in the monastic school who took in 3 children who arrived at the gate alone and taught them alongside the monk's students, and did not ask who they were or where they were from. These are not famous names. They are not names at all, mostly. But they inhabited the same winter and the same roads as everything else we have described, and the hunger road ran through them as it ran through everything else, and they did not let it take what they were. By 1322 the rains had eased. The precise meteorological reasons are still debated, but the agricultural evidence is unambiguous. The harvests of the early 1320s were better than they had been since before 1315. Not everywhere simultaneously, not without regional variation, not without the continuing complications of disrupted labour supply and depleted seed stocks and damaged drainage infrastructure. But across much of northern Europe, the cycle of failed harvests broke, and grain prices began, gradually and unevenly, to fall. The famine did not end dramatically. It dissolved. It thinned out. The desperate edge of it relaxed month by month, region by region, until what remained was not famine, but its aftermath. A landscape significantly depopulated, an agricultural system significantly disrupted, a social fabric significantly torn, and a generation of people carrying in their bodies and their memories the specific knowledge of what it felt like when everything ran out. The death toll of the Great Famine is impossible to calculate with precision, and historians have offered estimates that range widely. The most careful recent scholarship suggests that mortality in the worst affected regions, the Low Countries, parts of northern France, some English counties, may have reached 10 to 15% of the pre-famine population. In a region with no modern medical system, no governmental welfare state, and no ability to import food from regions unaffected by the crisis, this number represents a catastrophic loss of life concentrated primarily in the most vulnerable, the very young, the very old, the already sick, the poor. The survivors came back to altered landscapes. The first and most visible alteration was demographic. Villages that had lost 1/5 of their population, or 1/3, or in extreme cases more, showed the gaps in their fabric in every activity. Fewer ploughmen meant more land unworked. Fewer craftspeople meant longer waits for repair of tools and equipment. Fewer children meant slower rebuilding of the working population over the following decades. The labour shortage that would become a defining feature of post-Black Death European society, the labour shortage that would shift the power balance between lords and peasants so dramatically, had its origins in the demographic damage of the Great Famine as much as in the epidemic that followed it. The agricultural landscape itself had changed. Fields that had been abandoned during the famine years were reverting to rough scrub and secondary woodland. Drainage systems that had not been maintained were failing. The careful, centuries-long human engineering of the medieval agricultural landscape, the hedges and ditches and marl pits and water meadows that had gradually made the land so productive, was deteriorating in dozens of places simultaneously. The people who returned to these landscapes, or who had never left, who had survived in place through years that the road survivors could only imagine, faced a recovery that was psychologically as demanding as its practical dimensions. Medieval psychology did not have the vocabulary we would use to describe what we now recognise as post-traumatic responses. The intrusive memories, the hypervigilance, the difficulty reconnecting with ordinary life that are the predictable aftermath of extreme stress and loss. But the phenomenology was present even without the vocabulary, and it shows up in unexpected places in the post-famine record. The years immediately after the famine produced a wave of religious vow-making, formal promises made to specific saints in exchange for their intercession during the crisis, promises that now needed to be fulfilled. Pilgrimage traffic increased dramatically in the early 1320s. Churches received donations of objects that had been promised during the worst years. This wave of vow fulfillment is partly straightforwardly religious, but it also functions as a kind of accounting, a systematic attempt to close the ledgers that had been opened in extremis, to complete the transactional relationships with the divine that had constituted, for many people, the spiritual infrastructure of survival. Economically, the recovery was uneven in ways that would have long-term consequences for the structure of European society. The lords who had survived the famine with significant resources intact, who had been wealthy enough to weather 7 years of bad harvests without fundamental damage to their financial position, emerged from the famine in a relatively strong position, able to purchase abandoned land at prices collapsed by the crisis, able to hire labour from the pool of migrants who had not found permanent settlement elsewhere, able to expand their holdings at the expense of the smallholders who had been forced to sell or abandon. The rich got richer, or rather, the rich lost less, and what they did not lose they converted into advantages. The poor who survived got something different. They got, in many cases, a kind of social mobility that would not have been available to them in the pre-famine world. A skilled craftsperson who had migrated to a town and found work there during the famine years might in the aftermath find that the reduced urban population created opportunities, journeyman positions in guilds that were short of members, openings in craft networks that needed labour. A labourer who had left a crowded village and found work on a large estate might find that the post-famine labour shortage made his position more negotiable than it had ever been before. The Great Famine ended, and medieval Europe continued. Its people rebuilt, replanted, replenished. They carried the memory of the hunger road in their bodies, and their institutions and their theology and their social relationships, reshaping all of those things in ways that are still legible in the historical record. The famine did not break European civilization, but it changed it, sharpened it in some ways, and damaged it in others, and left it carrying a knowledge about the fragility of the systems that sustain ordinary life that would not fully be processed for generations. And then, less than 30 years later, the Black Death arrived. History moves through catastrophe and emerges on the other side with a different shape. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was not merely a pause in medieval European history, a disaster that arrived and departed and left things more or less as they had been. It was a generative catastrophe, one that produced in the process of destroying so much new social forms, new economic arrangements, new understandings of what institutions were for and how they should work. Consider poor relief. Before the Great Famine, the distribution of charity to the poor in medieval Europe was predominantly individual and informal. The almsgiving of private individuals, the irregular distributions of monasteries and churches, the ad hoc charity of guilds and confraternities to their own members and their immediate communities. The famine demonstrated conclusively, and at enormous human cost, that individual and informal charity was insufficient when the scale of need expanded beyond a certain threshold. The response that emerged in some of the most sophisticated urban governments of Northern Europe, the systematic census of the poor, the organised distribution, the municipal assumption of responsibility for the welfare of the destitute, was a genuine institutional innovation driven by the inadequacy of existing arrangements in the face of unprecedented demand. Consider the political relationship between peasants and lords. The labour shortage that the famine accelerated, compounded and intensified by the Black Death 30 years later, created conditions in which peasants, particularly skilled peasants in high demand, could make demands on their lords that would have been unthinkable in the overcrowded labour-surplus Europe of 1300. The 14th century would see, across England and France and the Low Countries and the Rhineland, a series of peasant revolts and protests that reflected a peasantry that had learned, through the extremity of the famine years, that the social arrangements they lived under were not inevitable but contingent, that lords needed labour as much as labour needed lords, and that this mutual need was a negotiating position. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie of 1358, the Flemish revolts of the mid-14th century, these are the dramatic, visible surface of a shift in the political consciousness of the European peasantry that the Great Famine had helped to produce. When you have been on the hunger road, when you have survived things that the ideology of your social order told you were the natural consequence of your natural inferiority, something changes in your relationship to that ideology. Consider the Church. The Great Famine accelerated a process of institutional questioning that would take another 2 centuries to reach its visible conclusion in the Reformation, but its traces are detectable in the religious history of the 14th century. The mystical movements of the 14th century, the German mysticism of Meister Eckhart and Heinrich Suso and Johannes Tauler, the English mystical tradition of Richard Roller and Julian of Norwich, the Dutch Devotio Moderna, all share a turn inward, a move toward direct personal experience of the divine that does not depend on institutional mediation. This turn was shaped by many factors, but one of them was the lived experience of a famine in which institutional religion's explanations proved inadequate to the reality being explained. Julian of Norwich, who wrote in the late 14th century from her anchorite cell in Norwich, produced in her Revelations of Divine Love a theology of God's love so unconditional and so practically focused on the human person in all her specific embodied reality that it represents a genuine departure from the penitential theology that had dominated the Church's response to the famine. Julian's God does not punish with famine. Julian's God says, in one of the most famous sentences of medieval English literature, that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. This is a theological claim, not a comfort. It is also, for a society that had spent a generation living through things that were not well, and being told they were divinely intended, a claim of extraordinary radicalism. Consider, finally, the roads themselves. The hunger roads of medieval Europe did not disappear after the famine ended. They persisted as physical infrastructure, as social memories, as patterns of movement that had been established in the crisis years and proved, when the crisis passed, to have created lasting channels. The routes along which famine migrants had travelled became, in some cases, the routes along which trade goods and seasonal labour and pilgrims continued to move. The towns that had been destinations became, in some cases, centres of ongoing economic activity that owed their growth partly to the influx of skills and labour that the famine had redirected toward them. The hunger road made the map of Europe slightly different from what it would have been. Not dramatically. Catastrophes rarely rewrite geography in the dramatic ways we tend to attribute to them, but in the small adjustments of density and connection and economic activity that constitute the ongoing life of a civilization, the traces of the famine's forced migrations are legible. The Great Famine left its mark in stone and in soil and in the genetic inheritance of the populations that survived it. It left its mark in the institutional structures that were built, however inadequately, to respond to it. It left its mark in the religious and intellectual life of the century that followed. And it left its mark in the specific, local, particular lives of the millions of people who walked the hunger road and made it home to wherever home turned out to be. They are not, most of them, in the record. The record did not follow them, but the world they made when they arrived, the towns that absorbed them, the crafts they practiced, the children they raised, the prayers they said to the saints who'd been their company on the road, that world is still in small ways visible in the European landscape today. The road is still there. She is still on the road. We have travelled a long way since we found her at the beginning, through the broken harvests and the broken bodies, through the monastery gates and the city walls, through the theology and the economics and the politics of a catastrophe that remade a world. And we return to her here not because her story has been resolved, but because her story is the point. Her name, we said, was something like Ailswith, or Margaret, or Catrin. She was 5 days out from a village that no longer existed as a functioning community. She carried a child who had stopped speaking, and a fragment of a saint's bone wrapped in linen, and the name of a town 3 days east. What happened to her? We don't know. The record does not have her name in it. She walked into the historical gap that received most of the people on the Hunger Road, and she stayed there, as nearly all of them stayed there, unnamed and unreachable. But we know some things about her. We know that she made a decision, however it felt to her, whatever she called it, to move when staying would have meant the end. That in a world that was closing its options one by one, she found the one that remained open and walked through it. We know that she carried not only the child and the bread and the relic, but knowledge. Knowledge of what the village had been, knowledge of what was possible in a human life, knowledge that would not survive her death in any document, but might survive it in a child who one day stopped being silent and began to speak, and eventually passed that knowledge, transformed and unrecognizable, to children of her own. We know that she was not alone on the road, that on every road in Northern Europe in the years we have been describing, there were people like her, thousands of them, hundreds of thousands, a migration of the hungry and the surviving that constitutes one of the largest movements of people in medieval European history. They did not see each other as a movement. They saw each other as individuals on the same road, sometimes helping and sometimes competing, and sometimes simply walking past each other in the mutual preoccupation of survival. But they were, collectively, something. They were the Hunger Road in motion. And we know, because the record shows us this in the scattered documents and the guild rolls and the votive offerings and the new neighbourhoods of old cities, that some of them made it. Not all, not most perhaps, but some. Enough. Enough that the world they arrived in was different for their having arrived, and different in ways that, if you know where to look, are still visible in the European world today. The child on her back would, if he survived, tell someone someday about the road. He would not remember it clearly. He was 5, and the worst of it came when he was past speaking and barely past full consciousness. But he would remember something. The cold, the motion, the weight of being carried, the sound of a road that was not his road, but became his road because the road was the only thing left. The Hunger Road ended, as all roads do somewhere, and the people who walked it made that somewhere into the world they built.